Welcome to Lecture 1.4, the only one about how to select a research method. This lecture is based on the College Board's course description for AP Psychology version 1. My name is Chris Gall, and I wrote the lecture. Specifically in this lecture, we're going to be focusing on how experimental design can make the results more or less valid, and how you can use what you know about experimental design to predict how valid the results are likely to be. The learning target for this lecture, provided by the College Board, is that you can predict the validity of behavioral explanations based on the quality of research design. Basically, can you examine a research procedure and predict whether or not the results are what they should be? Think of this kind of like estimating the answer in math to tell if you were probably right. It's the same basic idea. According to the American Psychological Association, validity is the degree to which empirical evidence and theoretical rationale support the adequacy and appropriateness of conclusions drawn from some form of assessment. Validity is multiple forms depending on the research questions and on the particular type of inference being made. For example, the three major types of test validity are criterion validity, based on a correlation with an accepted standard, construct validity, based on the conceptual variable underlying a test, and content validity, based on the subject matter of a test. Basically, it means how well does your evidence support the conclusions that you drew. There are many different types of validity, which you might examine depending on the type of study done and the methodology used. When you talk about testing, for example, with IQ testing, you could examine how well the scores on a test that you design correlate to a test that is a well-known standard IQ test. If we were talking about IQ tests, it means that if you gave a person both your test and another IQ test, say the Stanford-Binet test, which is an incredibly common one, then they should score basically the same on both tests. Construct validity means that what your test measures is what it's supposed to measure, and that what you're measuring actually exists. In the case of our example of the IQ test, that it measures something that actually exists, the general intelligence quotient. Okay, content validity means that in our imaginary IQ test that you wrote, that the questions are written in a way that they actually measure IQ and that you're not measuring something else with them. The basic idea behind validity is that your procedure measures what you want it to measure and does so in a way that you can be confident of the results. You should be able to tell this by comparing the procedure to the results. If the procedure is not written in a way that it controls for confounding variables, then the experiment is not valid. End of discussion. Procedures can be partially valid. Oftentimes, scientists will attempt to control for confounding variables at the analysis stage. The procedure itself may not be able to control for certain kind of confounding variables, and this is why the scientists will control for them when they analyze the results. How well they are able to do that can be judged based on the results themselves. If the results seem appropriate based on the procedures in the analysis, then the experiment is valid. Confounding variables are things which confuse the outcome. They influence it, but are not measured or accounted for within the procedure or within the analysis of the data. Like I said, they confuse the outcome. If there are confounding variables, then the procedure is not valid. And the reason it's not valid is because you have no idea how much or how little they have influenced the data and results. Scientific procedures should be identified at the time the procedure is written, and then, Confounding variables should be identified at the time the procedure is written and then ways to overcome them found and utilized. If they are not, then the experiment is not valid. The degree to which they are identified and controlled for is the degree to which you can judge your confidence in the results. For our purposes here, we are looking specifically at behavioral explanations. So, confounding variables are other things which might account for the behavior observed. But the same criteria apply. Whenever possible, variables that may confound the explanation should be accounted for. Those ones that are not measured, not accounted for, nor accounted for in the analysis make it less likely that the explanation of behaviors provided is valid. The more confounding variables, the less likely it is to be valid. Congratulations on reaching the end of this lecture. If you understood what you needed to from this lecture, then you know that confounding variables limit confidence in research conclusions. Confounding variables confuse the outcome. That is to say, they make it less valid. They do so by influencing the outcome to an unknown degree. To the degree that they can be accounted for, then, is the degree to which the explanation based on the results is valid. As a researcher, one of your jobs is to identify and account for potentially confounding variables. The goal is to do that job the best you can, and as a result, wind up with an explanation that is scientifically valid.